Hi there, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from around the world. I know we've got a good portion of our audience coming from the States today, and a good portion coming from Europe too. So thanks for tuning in today for the first in our automotive supply chain series. A couple of last minute changes to this setup. So we had a couple of speakers who unfortunately had to drop out for various reasons, but very grateful that we've got some fantastic guys in Christian and George with us today to share their insights, lessons learned from this disruptive and tricky period, and I'm sure we'll be able to advise on their experiences and things that other folks can take from that. Essentially the topic today is moving on from COVID-19, understanding what impact it's had on our businesses and how we can use those lessons to create greater resiliency for businesses going forward, and particularly using kind of supply chain operations for greater resiliency. And we've got a couple of different perspectives. George from the traditional kind of supply chain perspective, and Christian from the innovation and technology perspective. So I think both will provide a kind of a unique angle on the topic at hand. But I'll let the guys kind of introduce themselves, and then we'll get into a bit of a kind of a Q&A panel style discussion. Feel free also to ask questions and post them via GoToWebinar, and hopefully we'll have some time to pick up on those questions at the end of the session. But without further ado, I'll ask the guys to introduce themselves. Christian, perhaps you could go first and give everyone a brief intro to yourself and your background.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks for having me here. Very important topic, obviously. So my background, I'm responsible for Alliance Ventures, which is Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi's corporate venture capital arm. So we're all about finding startup companies that kind of disrupt the future, do things better, differently compared to how it was done in the past, and very much globally. So we have invested in China, in Europe, Israel, North America. So really the global perspective. And I think supply chain being one of the very much impacted trends right now is heavily on our radar, and we're mapping a lot of interesting technologies in the space as well. So thanks for having me.
Fantastic, thanks Christian. And George, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jamie, and very happy and honored to be here. Thanks for the invite. I've been working with Honda of America Manufacturing and various subsidiary companies within Honda North America for the last 30 years. I've had various roles and responsibilities working in Japan, in Mexico, as well as other parts of the US. I'm currently based in Columbus, Ohio. And my roles and responsibilities include many of the North American supply chain functions for Honda for the manufacturing side. Although I have some very capable counterparts on the aftermarket, I don't deal with the aftermarket side too much. Although we are always looking for opportunities for sharing in technologies and cost savings, et cetera. My responsibilities include the transportation within North America, the import and export functions, global functions for our factories here in North America as well as global, and also strategies and systems as they relate to supply chain for most, if not all, of our plants within North America.
Fantastic. So, I mean, both of you guys obviously have, broad expertise and a lot of expertise. So hopefully we'll be able to draw some of that out during, this kind of 45 minutes that we have today. Oftentimes when we have COVID-19 related discussions, I start by asking folks to look into their crystal balls and making estimations or guesses as to how things will unfold. But I think we're at a time where we are starting to across most cities and across most geographies move on from COVID-19 to a large extent with things reopening, you know, and that's from bars and cafes here in London to factories and manufacturing facilities too. And so, you know, given that we're at this stage or this phase of this disruption and this crisis, what have been the kind of the core lessons, I suppose, or core learnings that you both have experienced so far, which have been unique to this period? Christian, perhaps I could start off with you on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And I'm in New York City right now, so we are a little bit behind, but well on our way also to reopening hopefully soon. And just came back from Paris, where things are much further along. So exactly as you said. You know, I think we never had something like that before. So the reopening and the learnings, I think they're ongoing. I think we might need a year to really understand what the learnings are from this industry. But a couple things that played very well in my core business and what I'm doing all day is looking at innovative technologies. I think everybody is now looking at innovative technologies. How can we do this better? We had a phase now with COVID where it was heavily exposed, all the kind of the structural deficits that we have in supply chain and in doing business in general. I mean, supply chain is just many of those areas where we, despite a rapid advancement in technology, is still a lot of paper and pen, still a lot of handshake type of business style between suppliers and their factories. So I think this was exposed. What was also exposed is that it's not just efficiency, it's not just pricing. We cannot just optimize for this one thing where getting the perfect volume to one supplier so we get the cost down to the maximum and then the whole system is perfect. It doesn't really cut it anymore. Single supplier, putting everything on one card, on one region. I mean, the risks with COVID have exposed that this is not really possible anymore in the future. That's my strong belief. So, I mean, you saw it most in healthcare. I mean, who would have thought that all those modern countries in the world cannot just simply manufacture the mask and the supply that we need very quickly? I mean, I didn't think so. I thought we are able to do that. And so now we're seeing a lot of startup companies that already had great products before that are being approached much quicker and accelerated the digitalization really in a very interesting way.
Yeah, that's right. The term I've heard quite often is catalyst COVID-19, and it seems to be that, you know, it has accelerated timelines for technology developments and innovations and projects that oftentimes were in the planning anyway, but have been brought forward kind of out of necessity. And it's something I hear time and time again. And George, are you seeing something similar? Has COVID been a catalyst and accelerated things from a Honda perspective, but also just in terms of what you're seeing in the marketplace?
Yeah, you know, there's just so many things that we have been dealing with, and I say dealing with because it's not all negative. There's a lot of positive things, and it's really just causing people to think about things from different paradigms and thinking about how to improve our overall business and approach to business. In general, simple things like in manufacturing, we've always found it very difficult to work from home. I know that there's a lot of people and a lot of businesses that do that and do that quite successfully. But in our manufacturing business, and particularly for the functions that are tied closely to the lines, even being a support function, although we've recently, prior to COVID, we have somewhat relaxed our practices and offered more flexible work environments, it was still something that was very taboo. And now we were, you know, thrust into this to kind of sink or swim. And quite frankly, the team has done quite admirably. Our fiscal year started April 1, And of course, as most companies do, particularly the companies that are lagging, are forced into positions of being very aggressive for making business plans with innovative approaches and cost cutting, et cetera. And looking at our Q1, I was literally amazed at how well the team actually did with the time off, and that includes many, unfortunately, of our folks were furloughed for a period of time during the down period. So I think resilience. I think challenging all of us individually and how we've worked together collectively. And really pushing the envelope in many of these areas is, if we go back and think about it and reflect 3 to 6 months from now, I think we're going to focus on some of the things that were clear and present, but we're also going to think about some of these other approaches to business a little bit more deeply and what came from it. But our business is coming back, and it's coming back quite strong.
Fantastic. I mean, this situation has undoubtedly been a crisis for many reasons. From a health perspective, first and foremost, from people losing jobs or temporarily being furloughed, and the economic impacts broadly speaking. But through most crises, opportunities appear, and as we've kind of seen, innovation happens at an accelerated pace. And so if you could point, George, to, I guess, one or two things that you think will come out of this from a Honda perspective that will be good for long-term resilience, good for the long-term business model, what do you think the most positive outcomes will be?
Sure. We have been dealing with crises at, quite frankly, an accelerated pace for the last 5 to 10 years, more frequently and more severe over the last 3 to 5 years, with overseas flooding and earthquakes and tsunamis and all sorts of things that would normally disrupt the supply chain. Unrest in countries, civil unrest in countries, all of that seems to be more and more. And now with COVID, we back in the fall of last year at an automotive logistics conference, I made a couple statements that really caused people to scratch their head. And one of those in particular was that automotive in general really needs to consider deeply this approach to JIT. And where it makes sense, there needs to be economic inventory levels to be more resilient. We had already started implementing some of those practices, and quite frankly, as we were going into and coming out of COVID, I think some of those practices really positioned us well for our restart on May 11th. And so I would say in general that proving out some of our theories about and some of our approaches towards countermeasuring the crises in the past and what will come, this won't be our last crises, is quite nice. And I'll go back to a point that Christian made about, particularly in supply chain, we've been very antiquated with our systems and in our approaches, and we realize that we're still not out of the woods. We still have a lot of work to do in that area. But again, this is just another exclamation point on what we've been talking deeply about, which is the digitalization of the supply chain for the purposes of visibility that helps us to forecast some of these issues, but also to put the appropriate countermeasures in place proactively.
I think that's many interesting points kind of baked in within there. But as we were kind of talking about in the lobby before, these disruptions to an extent are inevitable. These black swan moments, the unpredictable is predictable in the fact that, you know, there will be mass scale disruptions that will happen. Something like this, I don't know what scale, will happen again, and we need to bake in the kind of the processes and systems and use the technologies to make sure that our businesses are resilient to that. And I think one of the interesting points you raised, Georgia, was around JIT and efficiency and optimization on the one hand versus kind of flexibility or resiliency on the other hand. And so I think that leads to an interesting kind of discussion around to what extent should redundancy be baked into supply chain, and should we be thinking about greater or different inventory methodology. But Christian, I think perhaps you could talk to the specific technologies around visibility and what you're seeing on that front, because I imagine, yeah, every conversation that I'm in, certainly visibility kind of underpins it all. And so I imagine there are conversations that you're exposed to quite a lot in your role.
Yeah, and maybe one point, if I may, on what you just said. You know, one of the reasons why resilience is hard, because it's also hard to build one functioning supply chain in the first place. So if you have to do everything with paper and pen in an antiquated way, then you don't really want to do this 2 or 3 times. It's just so much effort to do in the first place. So I think digitalization will create automatically also resilience, not just by transparency, but also by easier substitution of suppliers, of methods, and if you don't have to go through the whole cumbersome process that you went through in the first place. So to your point, it's all connected, and I think this transparency for me is really it's twofold. Transparency, of course, of where your goods are in the world, but also transparency on risks. I think the risk mapping, in addition to the supply chain of how you build it, is something I have seen a lot of innovative companies coming up with very intelligent ways of mapping all the information that are in the world and then putting them in context. Because of course we're reading the news, there's a flood in Indonesia or wherever, but then what does it really mean for you today? Which maybe tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers that are in your chain will have an impact on your direct supplier that then you will have a problem in 6 months. I mean, it's not really rocket science if you know there's a problem 6 months later. So let's just do something about it today. But often, unfortunately, this is not really being mapped, or this is not really being communicated in an efficient way. And I mean, most large companies like ours, like automotive companies, like George's and my employers, they spend a lot of time and energy on this topic. So this transparency of connecting with the suppliers of the suppliers, I believe, like the whole value chain approach is really a key point. And I think, Jamie, we had the pleasure of meeting first because of one of the companies that I found very interesting in France called Shipio, which it's a good example. They're doing exactly that. They're having a connective platform where you see where your shipments are in relation to your suppliers and to your plans. It's not rocket science. It's essentially replacing Excel files and whatever you used before, but it is extremely impactful. And this will bring you on eye level with your suppliers, because in the end you want to do the same thing. The supplier wants to do good business with you, and it will really help you to be more educated. So that's what I see right now.
Yeah, I think that's that's kind of what, I guess, the crux of it, the visibility and transparency and the kind of contextual risk. I think that the depth is also really interesting, where you're talking about your suppliers, and I guess the aggregate risk. So it's not just who you're dealing with, but it's the risk that they are exposed to. And I think as we come out of this COVID-19 situation, companies, broadly speaking, are asking themselves different questions and, you know, going into more level of depth and detail around the risk, I'm sure. And I think just by asking different questions, we find different results or different solutions. And so I think that's something that could be potentially an interesting takeaway. But I want to come back to your point around JIT, George, just briefly, just while it's kind of fresh in my head. You mentioned when you first raised this kind of concept a year or so ago at an industry event that there were maybe some raised eyebrows. And so what were the challenges, I suppose, in getting your methodology or your way of approaching inventory kind of pushed through and accepted? And to what advice would you give someone who wanted to implement a different methodology, let's say verging on the just in case as opposed to the just in time, in order to get buy-in from various stakeholders around the business?
Yeah, you know, Jamie, if you look at the different industries, retail, e-commerce, we'll set medical aside because that's a whole different complexity in terms of supply chain, and who the customers are and who the manufacturers and middle people are. But if you compare retailers and e-commerce, and I'm lumping, I know there's characteristic differences that can be quite different, but comparing those two to automotive and the supply chain, in the case of those two, if something happens and you don't have a particular SKU in stock, or a particular supplier of that SKU runs into problems in Indonesia and cannot supply that product, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 customers for that specific product that are going to be impacted, and that's not good. It's not good to have any customers impacted, but it's a bit more finite than automotive. And I say that because even one component, and Christian mentioned, we have, in Honda's case, within North America alone, we have 750 tier 1 suppliers, 750 plus, and tier 2 and below are thousands. And in some cases, we don't even know who those suppliers are because they're tier 1 or tier 2 controlled. And then you get into the raw materials and it becomes even more complex. And it really ends up being this quite big bowl of spaghetti. But just one of those components can shut an entire plant down or several lines within North America. And now you're impacting many facilities and many, many customers. So everything needs to work in harmony with the appropriate amount of inventory. So what I would say is, you know, we really have to measure the risk versus the reward of that model, or the ins and outs of that model. Probably when we first started talking about JIT for automotive, you know, space was at a premium, warehouse space was at a premium, labor was at a premium, capital was at a premium. You know, with interest rates, there was a time when holding that capital was not something that that the folks in accounting really looked at. And I remember early on in my career, one of our key metrics was what was our on-hand inventory and how much inventory were we keeping, and it was all about trying to minimize that number. I can't remember the last time that's been a metric on my business plan. People just don't talk about that anymore. Yet we haven't moved away from those practices. We haven't built in the fact that, again, some of those concerns and resource strains of the past are no longer there. However, what is there is clear and present dangers of crises, unprecedented crises that we've never seen. So it becomes pretty easy in versus out discussion when you're having those discussions with the decision makers. And I remember having a couple critical meetings with some of the folks back at headquarters in Japan, and it became usually it takes 9 or 10 meetings to get a point across, and we were able to do it in 2 or 3. So we believe that the message is clear, and it's with each one of these crises. that story is getting easier and easier to tell and to sell, quite frankly. We coming out of COVID, we get quite a bit of components from Mexico. And I believe, as everybody knows, Mexico was behind us on the curve. So as we were starting up May 11th, Mexico wasn't ready to start up. So we had to use our strategic reserves north of the border for a period of time to keep our factories running until the Mexico supply base could resume. Had we not had those strategic reserves, we wouldn't have been able to run production. So, and as I said, it just takes one part to shut an entire factory or region down, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, having those strategic reserves, you know, in that case, is crucial, and the proof is in the pudding there, with regards to kind of what you're saying. But Christian, I imagine in your role, you have oftentimes needed to sell technologies or systems or things internally within the business to get adoption and to get buy-in. And what is your advice in that regard? And you know, is this something that we should be leveraging, this situation, to push through better systems and technologies and push through change ultimately within our organizations for the greater good?
You know, as you said in the very beginning in the introduction, it's not really something that was not around or where companies didn't work on. I think every single OEM has some sort of project around this matter. I think it's not so much identifying, oh, oops, there is a technology that can do this versus paper and pen. It's more of okay, now there's an urgency, and we have seen the impact, and so now ideally the budgets are more readily available for this type of undertaking. The decision makers up to the CEO level say, okay, we need this tomorrow or today or yesterday, so I think all of this helps. I think what also helps is the improvements in all those technology buzzwords that we hear in the press all day, like 5G and artificial intelligence and robotics. All of this is also in at least in many industries or many subset of industries mature enough now where it also becomes affordable, and as George was describing, the ins and outs are bringing a good ROI for the business. So it was also related to that. And to be honest, the suppliers have also a problem, so they also want to solve it. So there is not just you pushing on this. And so for me, honestly, we have been always the advocate internally. We always have been trying to introduce new companies that can solve this. And so we get a lot of inbound interest now, like, okay, you know somebody else is doing this, hey, can you help us assess a little bit the quality of the company, kind of as an advisor, because our core business is to analyze the quality of startups, which is not really in the key DNA of OEMs, right? Like, we're used to balance sheets that are like 20 years in the back, or have 20 years of experience and make profit and are really resilient and have been around for a long time. Working with startups brings this challenge, and this was an adoption challenge before, and I think now for the lack of alternatives, of fast alternatives, this could be overcome easily in my view.
You mentioned a couple of technologies there, robotics and AI, and yeah, I'm just kind of scanning the audience questions as they come in, and one relates, I guess, to technology specifically, so I thought I'd just pick up on it now. And it's around what innovative technologies you find the most interesting. The audience members referenced AI, OCR and machine learning, but I guess going out to both of you, what technologies are you personally kind of interested in, and do you foresee potentially having the most impact on resiliency and supply chain resilience specifically? Do any come to mind?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Jamie. I think AI from the standpoint of predictability and maybe, as Christian already mentioned, that you know, just trying to map the business and predict scenarios based on events in certain regions or potential events in certain regions, and being able to proactively, not only predictive, but many times an event will happen, and we're just not getting the information and we're not reacting quick enough. So reacting to an event, putting that information in front of a supply chain managing operator in a more timely manner would definitely be a much needed application moving forward. Some of the very mundane tasks through automated machine tasking is going to be huge moving forward. No longer do we have time to spend on building Excel spreadsheets or interpreting Excel spreadsheets or anything of that nature. Anything that can be automated in anyone's daily job or process or task is going to be extremely important moving forward. We need to be less doers and more managers of the supply chain. We have to have the proper tools to be able to do those things. And I will say that as companies are coming out of this, Honda included, there's not a huge appetite for spending large amounts of capital on some of these tools. However, there is an appetite to partner with logistics service providers, for example, or other companies, for example, that have this technology or have already developed this technology or are leasing or using this technology in one way, shape, or form, and partnering with those companies rather than bringing that burden on directly. So there's a need. We just have to find the appropriate path to satisfy that need.
Mm. And so when you are, let's say, assessing a new logistics service provider as part of your network, are these questions you're directly asking? So what technology are they kind of building into their service? Is this becoming something that is increasingly important from a partner acquisition perspective?
Absolutely. And not only that, the number of solutions out there are many. Quite frankly, and it's almost overwhelming, the number of solutions and new startups that are coming out. So we're looking for partners that can sift through all of that and really come up with the best solution for our need. We're not necessarily looking for the next shiny hammer. We're looking for what is our problem and what is the most effective and efficient and easy to run option or tool to solve that problem. So those are the companies that I think are going to be very valuable moving forward. Those logistics service providers that have a method, have an R&D team, for example, either they're developing these solutions in-house or they're partnering with some of these smaller companies and developing or putting themselves in a position where they can provide these solutions to the end users.
And I suppose in a way, their business model will be evolving as technology service providers as well as logistics service providers in that sense, which is an interesting potential evolution. And Christian, in your role, you'll be on the hunt for tools and effective solutions too, not just your bright shiny technology. And I think for those of us who aren't maybe as au fait with technology as you are, sometimes we can get distracted by the shiny new tool, which looks really fun and interesting. But where do you see potentially the most value from a technology perspective for supply chain leaders and the automotive industry more broadly, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to disconnect the technologies from each other entirely, but if I would want to focus on some, it's, as George said, artificial intelligence. And the reason for that is you essentially replace a mundane human task that really doesn't add a lot of value in the end. It's just gathering information, gathering trigger points, and then putting this in front of the people that can then focus on, as George said, the managing of that information and what it really means. So more the intelligence layer versus information gathering layer. It's also much more efficient, so people can do much more optimization versus just data gathering. So artificial intelligence for that is important. The risk connecting the different dots for that is also important. So knowing that something happened in Indonesia and something happens in Mexico is connected. I mean, you know, people that have been doing it for 30, 40 years, they might know this, but if you want to put new people in that job, they probably don't know that, and we'll have to relearn this. The other technology area, I would call it connectivity. And with that, you can put in, you know, the Internet of Things, kind of connecting all the things and having all the things talk to each other. Once you have this, you're replacing mundane tasks that that the machine can do directly, giving check-ins and check-outs. So today somebody needs to call the driver to, where are you right now, or did you already offload this, and is this piece already there and there? Now it's all automatically, and the driver can focus on driving and other more higher jobs. In this, also 5G is kind of an enabling technology which makes this Internet of Things even more powerful. So it's not that Internet of Things without that wouldn't work, but it's even kind of bringing it to the next level. So artificial intelligence and connectivity would be the two to focus on, in my view.
Yeah. And you both referenced kind of visibility, and again, visibility is something that comes up in multiple conversations, most conversations related to supply chain, certainly. And Christian, you referenced Shipio, a company that you know well, and what they're doing on the global kind of risk front and spotting potential risk and mapping that out and providing kind of contextual information. But I guess the next step is, and this is in part a question from someone from the audience, it's kind of about simulating the impact of risk and what that might be. So do you folks have thoughts about how supply chain leaders in the automotive space should go about effectively simulating impact so that the risk isn't just understood, but the potential ramifications of that are understood and planned for as well, so we can have that kind of flexibility and be able to react quickly?
Yeah, I mean, if I may jump in there, the simulation is one of the most difficult tasks if you don't have proper information level in a digital way. It really requires research institutes to do that. I saw interesting studies on that, but they're really done by kind of researchers. So it shouldn't be a researcher higher education type of task. It should be part of this network that I was describing. And, you know, really simulation helps with so many different things, including preparing resilience, preparing or identifying risks that you didn't even think of. And this is, again, where artificial intelligence is a driver, right? It's artificial intelligence can essentially spin up 1 million simulations and see where things end up happening the most, and you can focus on the top problem first, and instead of discovering all problems first as a human, which is very hard to do, and then focusing on that. And it's really about, if you think about human error, right? It's like, if you have a very experienced guy doing it, that's great. But if you don't have the right person at the right point, then you will probably miss something. And getting away from this single point of error or kind of accidentally discovery of errors into a more robustness in technology is connected to simulation as much as all the other things I said.
Yeah. And George, what are your thoughts on simulation, I guess, and kind of scenario analysis, but I guess more broadly speaking, your thoughts on, you know, how we should build in that kind of flexibility and be able to create a system whereby we can be reactive at speed to potential unforeseen disruptions?
Sure. So, the first thing I'll say is I think that you can help build the simulation logic. You can go a long way by just creating a risk management function within your organization. We have what I believe is a pretty robust risk management function. It can be labor intensive. Again, it's not very fancy. It's really a lot of people spending some time talking about what could go wrong and listing those, prioritizing those through past frequencies and past impacts, and based on that, some ranking of prioritization. And once those potential risks are ranked, you're implementing activities and checkpoints to ensure that, one, you understand when they happen, and two, what you're doing about them to either prevent them from happening or immediate countermeasures for when they do happen. And it's like anything else. If you put this at the forefront and there is some regular reporting requirements and regular discussion around this, then you tend to stay ahead of the curve, if you will, or at a minimum, you're well positioned to have a team immediately attack the item as it comes up, because you've been discussing it and you've been discussing various scenarios and how to deal with it. But again, Christian said early on, and I think it makes a lot of sense, a lot of supply chain, there's not a whole lot of rocket science with it. I usually say that there's nothing extraordinary about supply chain management. It's doing very, very mundane tasks extraordinarily well and doing many of them. So this is where anything that we can automate to take some of those mundane tasks away will allow us to focus on the management, will allow us to be a little bit more predictive, and again, at a very minimum, allow us to be very nimble for when some crises or mini crises. I mean, we have in our business, we have crises daily, multiple crises daily. Supplier one, they had a fire and they happen to be the only supplier of this particular component. We have to run in there and pull the tools out of a burnt building and get them to the next building. So a lot of times, again, it's timing and having that immediate feedback when an event does happen. So I want to know immediately. I'd like to get a text, hey, supplier ABC just went down. There's a good chance they're not going to be able to supply parts for the next, several weeks or months. So there's differing degrees of visibility. There's differing degrees of technology, but mapping what you currently have and then trying to identify those tools that not only identify an issue, but making sure that we properly communicate that issue to the affected and impacted folks is what's very important for us.
One thing I picked up on there is you saying the importance of having it at the forefront. So if I'm understanding you correctly, George, it's important to have a cultural emphasis on this as well in order to ensure it is at the forefront.
Absolutely, absolutely. You have to have a culture of knowing that there is going to be crises, of knowing there's risks, and you have to, on purpose, create the structure and the mindset that we are going to have issues, and how do we deal with these issues when they happen. And then again, based on past history, what things can we put in place? What measures can we put in place to try to avoid some of these issues, at a minimum, avoid the impact of some of these issues when they happen?
Fantastic, fantastic. So we only have a couple of minutes left, but I'd love to get kind of final thoughts from you both. And I promise not to ask you to look into your crystal balls, and so I won't do that. But you know, as you kind of look forward to the next 12 or 18 months, without being able to or looking to predict what the future holds, but knowing that, you know, uncertainty will remain, what kind of leaving pieces of advice would you give those folks in the audience to ensure resilience as best as possible and to, I guess, protect ongoing business, considering that, you know, this is a potentially turbulent time?
Sure, I'll jump in. Again, I think it starts with a solid risk management philosophy, and that translates directly into character of the business and specific action and activity around risk management. And I believe that we're going to continue to head down the path of putting the necessary tools in place to give us visibility around not only the risk, but how well our current supply chain is running with an eye towards constant improvement. I'll give just one example of what we've been in the process of implementing. We have thousands, tens of thousands of returnable containers throughout our supply chain, hundreds of thousands throughout North America. And we have implemented an RFID program for those containers for the purpose of tracking those containers. What we're finding through this is the amount of data that we're getting out of these tracking points is a bit overwhelming, and we're trying to figure out what to do with it. But there's many opportunities. They're almost infinite at this point in terms of not just tracking our returnable containers, but on the outbound, but the containers on the inbound as well. So we're looking at things like dwell. How long did they dwell? Why were they dwelling? It's allowing us to proactively ask questions. So we'll continue down this path of risk management with tools in place towards visualization and digitalization to finally satisfy the right makeup of whatever our production requirements are to meet the customer's demands.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing, George. And Christian, any kind of final thoughts or advice, I suppose?
Yeah, you know, I think maybe two things. This crisis moment, or any crisis, is always a moment and the opportunity to reset. I think everybody should try to reset expectations and reset the status quo in a way and say, okay, I know for the last 50 years we did this, but now we have a reason to change, and we have the momentum to change, and technology is there. But really, would any decision maker in supply chain would urge to forget all the reasons why things don't work. Let's think, okay, why do we have to change, and then let's figure it out separately. The second point is the connectiveness of the pieces. What I mean with that, the supply chain is not just supply chain. Supply chain is connected to manufacturing, it's connected to the customers ordering the product and all of this. So I think here there needs to be a better connection between the pieces to have not just the transparency for the sake of transparency, but really to connect the whole business together. This is a massive opportunity, and this will support a future business, and will help us with a lot of those COVID problems. And technology is great, so don't be afraid of the shiny tool. Sometimes shiny is just shiny, it's just better, and it's doing things differently. But you know, different is good. If the world is different, you also have to do things differently. So I think that's maybe my crystal ball, or my forward-looking advice.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way to kind of end it on a similar note to how we started it. Was, you know, that there is opportunity to be had, and there's a chance now to change the way things are done for the better. And I think with that kind of mindset and mentality, there can be positive things taken from, undoubtedly a bad situation. So I think that's a really kind of a nice way to kind of end it. So I mean, I've really enjoyed sharing opinion with you guys today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for for being good sports and for sharing your time and ideas with us all, and particularly given you had to shoulder a little bit more burden as it was a slightly smaller panel than we had kind of predicted and planned for. But I think this is a case in point. It's during this time we have to be a bit more flexible and roll with the punches somewhat, and we've done that effectively today. And so I hope everyone in the audience has enjoyed what George and Christian have had to share today, and hopefully with the other folks that were due to be on but sadly couldn't, we'll be able to get their opinions later down the line in the series somewhere. But thanks everyone for listening in. Thanks George, thanks Christian for sharing your thoughts and time with us all, and see you all next time.
Great. Thank you very much, Jamie. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you, Jamie.
Cheers.